Some stories remind us why we love. Some stories remind us why we grieve. And some stories do both at once, tearing open old wounds while simultaneously healing them with the gentle balm of unconditional devotion. This is one of those stories. In a quiet corner of rural Montana, where the mountains kiss the sky and the winds carry whispers of seasons past, an elderly man named Walter Morgan lived alone. His wife had passed. His children had moved away. His heart had grown cold, protected by walls he built brick by brick, day by day, year by year, until one autumn morning, when everything changed. What collapsed at his gate that foggy dawn wasn't just a dog. It was a living, breathing reminder of everything he had lost, everything he had run from, and everything he thought he would never feel again. This is the story of Max, an old German shepherd who traveled over 200 miles on bleeding paws and an unwavering heart, just to find the one person he needed to see before his time ran out. This is the story of Walter, a man who thought he was beyond saving, beyond feeling, beyond love. And this is the story of how they saved each other. Grab a tissue. You're going to need it. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another incredible story of love, loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds that connect us across time and distance. Drop a comment below telling us about your most loyal pet. We read every single one, and your story might be featured in our next video. Now, let's begin this unforgettable journey. The morning of October 17th began like every other morning in Walter Morgan's life. The 68-year-old retired carpenter woke at 5:30, as he had done for the past 40 years. He made his coffee black, 2 sugars, in the same chipped mug his late wife Helen had bought at a county fair decades ago. He sat in his worn leather chair by the window and watched the fog roll across the Montana hills, like a slow gray river searching for the sea. Walter Morgan was a man of routine because routine was safe. Routine didn't ask questions. Routine didn't demand emotions. Routine simply existed. And that was enough for a man who had stopped truly living 3 years ago when they lowered Helen into the cold October ground. At 6:15, as was his habit, Walter opened the front door to retrieve the morning newspaper from his mailbox at the end of the gravel driveway. The fog was thick that morning, thicker than usual, and he had to squint to see past the old oak tree that Helen had planted when they first bought this property 32 years ago. He took 3 steps onto the porch before he stopped cold. There at the gate was a shape. At first, Walter thought it was a pile of old blankets someone had dumped, perhaps teenagers playing a prank or a passing driver discarding unwanted cargo. But then the shape moved. Just barely. Just enough. Walter's heart, that cold and protected organ he had worked so hard to shield from further pain, began to beat faster. He walked down the porch steps, his bare feet cold against the wooden boards, then colder still against the gravel of the driveway. The fog swirled around him like ghostly fingers reaching, touching, guiding him forward. And then he saw. It was a dog. A German shepherd, old and gray around the muzzle, with fur that was matted and dirty and tangled with burrs and leaves and the debris of a long, hard journey. The dog was lying on its side, its rib cage visible through its thin coat, its breathing shallow and labored. Walter knelt down, his knees protesting against the cold, hard ground, and he reached out a trembling hand to touch the dog's head. The dog opened its eyes, and in that moment, Walter Morgan felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. He felt recognition. Not the kind of recognition that comes from seeing an old friend or remembering a familiar face. This was deeper. This was primal. This was the kind of recognition that bypasses the brain entirely and speaks directly to the soul. The dog looked at Walter. Walter looked at the dog. And something passed between them, something wordless and ancient and profound. The dog's tail moved. Just once. Just a weak, tired thump against the cold ground. But it was enough. Walter gathered the old German shepherd in his arms. The dog was heavy, far heavier than his thin frame suggested, but Walter didn't care. He lifted the animal as gently as if he were lifting a sleeping child and carried him up the driveway, up the porch steps, and into the warm safety of his home. He laid the dog on a pile of blankets near the fireplace and immediately set to work building a fire. His hands moved automatically, years of muscle memory taking over while his mind raced with questions. Where had this dog come from? How long had it been traveling? Why had it collapsed at his gate, of all places? On this particular morning, Walter heated water and found some leftover chicken in the refrigerator. He sat beside the dog and offered small pieces of food, watching as the animal ate slowly, painfully, but with a determination that spoke of a spirit not yet ready to surrender. It was then that Walter noticed the collar. Old, worn, nearly hidden beneath the matted fur. He reached out and turned the small metal tag toward the light, and the world stopped. One word, 5 letters. A name that sent Walter spiraling back through time, back through grief, back through every wall he had built around his broken heart. The tag read, Max. Walter's hands began to shake. His vision blurred with tears. He thought he had forgotten how to cry, because Walter knew a dog named Max. He had known him very well, once upon a time, in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. Max had been Helen's dog, and Walter had given him away the day after she died. Walter sat motionless on the cold hardwood floor, his back against the stone fireplace, his eyes fixed on the old German shepherd who now slept fitfully on the pile of blankets. The fire crackled and popped, sending dancing shadows across the walls of the small living room. But Walter saw none of it. He was lost in the past, drowning in memories he had spent 3 years trying to forget. Helen had found Max at a shelter in Billings 8 years ago, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in March. Walter remembered the day perfectly because he had argued against getting a dog. They were too old, he had said, too set in their ways. A dog would be too much work, too much responsibility, too much change in a life that had finally settled into comfortable predictability. But Helen had looked at him with those green eyes that had captured his heart 40 years earlier, and she had smiled that smile that still made him weak in the knees even after 4 decades of marriage. And she had said the words that ended every argument they had ever had. Trust me, Walter, this is meant to be. And so they had brought home a German shepherd puppy with paws too big for his body, and ears that flopped instead of standing straight, and a tail that never stopped wagging from the moment he entered their lives. Helen had named him Max, after her grandfather Maximilian, a German immigrant who had come to America with nothing but hope and had built a life through hard work and unwavering determination. She said the puppy had the same spirit, the same stubborn refusal to give up, the same fierce loyalty that had defined her grandfather's character. Walter had pretended to be annoyed by the new addition to their household. He complained about the chewed slippers and the muddy paw prints and the early morning walks in the freezing Montana winters. But secretly, in the quiet corners of his heart, he showed to no one, Walter loved that dog as much as Helen did. Max grew into a magnificent animal, strong and noble and intelligent beyond what Walter had thought possible for a dog. He seemed to understand human speech, responded to conversations as if he were a participant rather than merely an observer. He knew when Helen was sad and would lay his great head in her lap until she smiled again. He knew when Walter was stressed and would bring him his slippers and sit quietly beside his chair until the tension melted away. For 6 beautiful years, Max was the heart of their home, the bridge between Walter's stoic silence and Helen's effervescent joy, the common ground where 2 very different people found unity and peace. And then Helen got sick. The diagnosis came on a sunny September morning, delivered in the sterile office of an oncologist in Helena. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Inoperable. Terminal. 6 months to live, maybe less. Walter remembered sitting in that office, holding Helen's hand, feeling the world crumble around him like a sandcastle before an incoming tide. He remembered the drive home, the silence in the car broken only by Helen's quiet voice saying, "We're going to be okay, Walter. We're going to make the most of every moment we have left." And they did. 4 or 5 months. They lived more fully than they had in years. They watched every sunrise and sunset. They took slow walks through their property, Ellen leaning on Walter's arm, while Max padded faithfully beside them. They talked about everything and nothing, filling the spaces between words of a lifetime of love. Max never left Helen's side during those final months. He slept beside her bed, his great head resting on the mattress where he could watch her face. He seemed to know, in that mysterious way that animals sometimes know, that time was running out, and he seemed determined to give her every ounce of comfort and love his loyal heart could offer. Helen passed away on a cold February evening, with Walter holding her right hand and Max's head resting on her left. Her last words, whispered so softly that Walter had to lean close to hear, were, "Take care of each other." But Walter didn't take care of Max. Instead, in the fog of grief that consumed him in the days following Helen's death, Walter made a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. He called Helen's sister Margaret, who lived 200 miles away in a small town near the Idaho border, and he asked her to take Max. He couldn't look at the dog without seeing Helen. He couldn't hear Max's footsteps without expecting to see her walking beside him. The dog was a living, breathing reminder of everything he had lost, and in his brokenness, Walter believed that the only way to survive was to remove every trace of the life they had shared. Margaret had been surprised but willing. She loved Max too, and had often visited specifically to spend time with the loyal German shepherd. She drove up the next day and loaded Max into her car, and Walter watched from the window as they drove away. Max had looked back at the house, at Walter, his eyes confused and sad, and Walter had turned away. The phone call came on the third day after Max collapsed at Walter's gate. It was Martha Hensley, an old friend who still lived near Margaret's property and kept in touch with the scattered community of elderly folks in that remote corner of Montana. Walter listened in silence as Martha told him what she knew. Margaret had passed away 2 months ago, suddenly and without warning, from a massive heart attack that took her in her sleep. She had been 72 years old, in seemingly good health, and her death had shocked everyone who knew her. The family had gathered for the funeral, distant relatives who lived in cities far away and visited only for weddings and funerals and the reading of wills. They had sorted through Margaret's possessions with the efficient detachment of people who had no emotional connection to the items they were dividing, and no one had wanted Max. He was too old, they said, 11 years old, with gray on his muzzle and stiffness in his joints, and the unmistakable weariness of a dog in the twilight of his life. He would be too expensive to care for, too much trouble, too likely to die soon and leave them with veterinary bills and the inconvenience of grief. So they had taken him to a shelter. Martha's voice grew thick with emotion as she continued the story. The shelter workers had reported that Max refused to eat for the first week. He lay in his kennel, face toward the wall, unresponsive to the kind volunteers who tried to coax him back to life. They thought he would die there, alone and heartbroken, just another old dog abandoned by a world that no longer had use for him. But then something changed. One morning, the shelter workers arrived to find Max standing at the gate of his kennel, alert and focused, his eyes fixed on something no one else could see. He paced back and forth, whining softly, his entire body tense with purpose. That afternoon, during a routine outdoor exercise period, Max escaped. No one knew how he did it. The fence was 6 feet high, and Max was an old dog with bad hips and tired bones. But somehow, impossibly, he got out. Search parties were organized. Volunteers drove the surrounding roads, calling his name, leaving food out at strategic locations. But Max was gone, vanished into the vast wilderness of rural Montana, like a ghost with unfinished business. 2 weeks passed, then 3, then a month. Everyone assumed Max was dead, another casualty of the wild predators and harsh conditions that claimed so many animals in that unforgiving landscape. But Max was not dead. Max was walking. Martha had pieced together the story from various reports that filtered back to her in the weeks following Max's disappearance. A rancher 40 miles north of Margaret's property had seen an old German shepherd walking along the highway, moving with slow but determined purpose. A family camping near the Bitterroot Mountains had found a dog matching Max's description drinking from a stream, his paws bloody and raw. A truck driver had stopped to offer food to a limping German shepherd near the Continental Divide, and the dog had eaten quickly before continuing on, heading steadily northeast despite the driver's attempts to coax him into the warm cab of his truck. 200 miles, over mountains and through valleys, across rivers and through forests, in rain and snow and the bitter cold of late autumn. An 11-year-old dog with failing hips and a broken heart had traveled 200 miles, and he had come directly to Walter's gate. Walter set down the phone and looked at Max, who was watching him with those deep brown eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. The dog's paws were bandaged now, treated by the local veterinarian who had made a house call at Walter's desperate request. His fur was clean and brushed, his belly full of warm food and fresh water. But it was a look in Max's eyes that broke something open inside Walter. It was forgiveness. Pure, unconditional, absolute forgiveness. Walter had abandoned Max in his darkest hour. He had sent away the one living creature who had shared Helen's final moments, who had loved her as purely and completely as Walter himself had loved her. He had been selfish and cowardly and cruel, and he had spent 3 years trying to forget what he had done. But Max had not forgotten. Max had remembered, and Max had come back, not for revenge, not for justice, but for love. Because that's what dogs do. That's what love does. It forgives. It perseveres. It travels 200 miles on bleeding paws just for the chance to look into the eyes of the one it loves. One more time. Walter knelt beside Max and buried his face in the dog's soft fur. And for the first time since Helen's funeral, Walter Morgan wept. The days that followed were unlike any Walter had experienced since Helen's death. For 3 years, he had moved through life like a ghost, going through the motions of existence without actually living. He woke, he ate, he slept, he repeated. The world continued to spin. Seasons changed, years passed, and Walter remained frozen in the amber of his grief. But Max changed everything. It started with small things. Walter found himself waking earlier, not because of routine, but because Max needed to go outside. He stood on the porch in the gray dawn light, watching the old dog slowly explore the yard, sniffing at bushes and trees with the careful attention of an animal relearning a place he had once known. Walter started cooking again. Real cooking, not the frozen dinners and canned soups that had sustained him for years. He made chicken and rice for Max, remembering how Helen used to prepare special meals for the dog on his birthday. He found himself eating the same food, sitting on the kitchen floor with Max, sharing a meal like two old friends who had found each other after a long separation. The walks came next. At first, they were short, just to the end of the driveway and back. Max's legs were weak, his joints stiff from age and the incredible journey he had undertaken. But each day, they went a little farther, to the old oak tree, to the small pond where Walter and Helen used to sit on summer evenings, to the hill overlooking the valley, where you could see for miles in every direction. Walter began to talk during these walks. At first, just simple observations about the weather or the wildlife they encountered. But gradually, the dam broke, and words came pouring out that had been trapped inside him for 3 years. He told Max about the guilt he felt for not being able to save Helen. He talked about the anger that had consumed him in the months after her death. Anger at the doctors who couldn't cure her, anger at God for taking her, anger at himself for every moment he had wasted on trivial things instead of cherishing the time they had. He confessed his shame about sending Max away. He spoke the words out loud, acknowledging for the first time the cruelty of what he had done, the selfishness of trying to erase his pain by exiling the one creature who could have helped him through it. And Max listened. He walked slowly beside Walter, his ears perked forward, his eyes occasionally glancing up at the old man's face. He didn't judge. He didn't offer solutions or empty platitudes. He simply listened, present and patient, a witness to Walter's pain. Something shifted in Walter during those walks. The walls he had built, those thick fortifications of numbness and routine that had protected him from feeling anything at all, began to crumble. And what emerged from behind those walls was not just pain, though there was pain, but something else as well. There was gratitude. Gratitude for the 40 years he had spent with Helen. Gratitude for the home they had built together. Gratitude for the love that filled their days, a love so strong that it had somehow reached across death and distance to bring Max back to his door. There was hope, fragile and tentative, like the first green shoots of spring pushing through frozen ground. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the rest of his life didn't have to be an exercise in waiting to die. Hope that there could still be moments of joy, of connection, of meaning. And there was love. That was the most surprising discovery of all. Walter had assumed that his capacity for love had been buried with Helen, that the part of his heart that knew how to care had withered and died from neglect. But as he watched Max sleeping by the fire, as he felt the warm weight of the dog's head on his lap, As he saw the trust and devotion in those ancient brown eyes, Walter realized that love wasn't something that could be killed. It could be buried. It could be hidden. It could be denied and ignored and locked away in the darkest corners of a broken heart. But it could not be destroyed. And now, in the twilight of both their lives, Walter and Max had found their way back to love. Walter began calling old friends he had pushed away after Helen's death. He invited his neighbor Robert over for coffee, and they sat on the porch watching Max explore the yard while they talked about fishing and weather and nothing in particular. He called his daughter Sarah in California, and for the first time in years, he didn't rush to end the conversation. He told her about Max. He told her the whole story, crying openly as he described the dog's impossible journey and what it had meant to him. And Sarah cried too, and when she asked if she could come visit, Walter said yes. For the first time in 3 years, Walter said yes to life. 3 weeks passed, and Walter knew. He had known from the beginning, really, from the moment he lifted Max's frail body from the cold ground at his gate. But knowing something in your mind and accepting it in your heart are two very different things. Max was dying. The veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Chun, had been honest with Walter from the start. Max's kidneys were failing. His heart was weak. The 200-mile journey had pushed his elderly body beyond its limits, and while food and rest and love could ease his discomfort, nothing could reverse the inevitable. He's an old dog who has lived a full life and experienced a kind of love that most creatures never know, Dr. Chen had said, her hand resting gently on Max's head. The best thing you can do now is make his remaining time peaceful and full of comfort. Walter had nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat, and so he had set about making Max's final days the best they could possibly be. He moved Max's blankets to the spot by the window where Helen used to sit and read. From there, Max could see the yard, the oak tree, the hills rolling away toward the horizon. He could watch the birds at the feeder and the squirrels chasing each other through the branches and the clouds drifting across the endless Montana sky. Walter slept on the couch just a few feet away, so that Max was never alone. When Max stirred in the night, Walter was there with gentle hands and soft words. When Max whimpered in his sleep, lost in dreams that might have been memories, Walter stroked his fur and hummed the lullabies that Helen used to sing. The days developed their own rhythm, a sacred routine centered entirely around Max's comfort. Morning sun on the porch, soft food given by hand. When Max grew too weak to eat from a bowl, slow walks that became slower, then stopped altogether as Max's legs could no longer carry him. Walter carried him instead. He would lift Max in his arms, just as he had on that first morning, and carry him outside to feel the sun on his face and the breeze ruffling his fur. He would set Max down on a blanket in the yard and sit beside him, pointing out birds and clouds and the changing colors of autumn as if Max could understand every word. Maybe he could. Walter had stopped doubting the depth of Max's understanding. On the night before the end, Walter sat with Max by the fire and told him everything that was in his heart. He told Max about Helen, about how they had met at a dance in 1975, when Walter was young and clumsy and too shy to ask a girl to dance. Helen had asked him instead, marching across the gymnasium floor with a confidence that took his breath away, grabbing his hand and pulling him onto the dance floor before he could stammer an excuse. He told Max about their wedding, a small ceremony in Helen's parents' backyard, with roses everywhere because roses were her favorite. He told him about the lean years when they were first starting out, when they ate beans and rice for dinner and counted every penny. He told him about the good years that followed, when Walter's carpentry business took off, and they bought this house and filled it with laughter and love. He told Max about the children, about Sarah's first steps and Michael's first words, and all the Christmas mornings and birthday parties and ordinary Tuesday evenings that had somehow added up to a life. And he told Max about Helen's death, about holding her hand as she slipped away, about the unbearable silence that followed, about the years of numbness and isolation, and the walls he had built so high that he had almost forgotten there was anything beyond them. "You broke through those walls, Max," Walter whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You traveled 200 miles to remind me how to love, how to feel, how to be alive." Max's tail thumped weakly against the blanket. Just once. Just enough. I know you have to go soon, Walter continued, and I know you'll find Helen. She's waiting for you, I'm sure of it. Probably already has your favorite treats ready. Max's eyes were closed now, but his breathing was peaceful. When you see her, tell her I'm sorry it took me so long to understand. Tell her I'm going to be okay. Tell her I love her, and I'll love her until my last breath, and then I'll find you both again. Walter lay down on the floor beside Max, wrapping his arm around the old dog's body, feeling the faint heartbeat beneath the soft fur. Thank you, Max. Thank you for coming home. They slept like that, man and dog, two old souls who had found each other at the end of a long and winding road. When Walter woke at dawn, the heartbeat was gone. Spring arrived in Montana, the way it always does, slowly and then all at once, transforming the gray and brown landscape into an explosion of green and gold and wildflower purple. The snow melted from the mountains, filling the streams with cold, clear water. The birds returned from their winter migrations, filling the air with songs of renewal and hope. Walter stood in his garden on a May morning, looking at the two stones that marked the resting places of the ones he had loved most in this world. Helen's stone had been there for 3 years, weathered now by sun and rain and the passage of seasons. Beside it, smaller but no less significant, was Max's stone, placed there 3 months ago on a cold February afternoon when the ground was barely soft enough to dig. Walter had carved the stones himself, using skills he had learned decades ago but had not practiced in years. Helen's read simply, "Beloved wife, beloved friend, forever in my heart." Max's was longer, because Max's story deserved more words. He crossed mountains to come home, faithful to the end, until we meet again. Walter knelt between the stones and laid fresh flowers on each grave. Roses for Helen, because roses had always been her favorite. Wild mountain flowers for Max, gathered from the hills they had walked together in those precious final weeks. "Good morning, you two," Walter said softly. "It's a beautiful day. The kind of day you always loved, Helen. The kind of day Max would have spent chasing squirrels and pretending he was still young." He sat back on his heels and looked out at the property, at the oak tree Helen had planted, at the porch where they had spent countless summer evenings, at the hills rolling away toward the distant mountains. "I'm doing better," he continued. "I know you both wanted to tell you that. I'm eating real food. I'm sleeping through the night. I even went into town last week and had coffee at that little shop you always liked, Helen. They still make that cinnamon roll you loved." Walter smiled, remembering. "Sarah came to visit last month. We talked for hours, really talked, the way we should have been talking all along. She forgives me for shutting her out. She understands now, I think, how lost I was. She's coming back in June, bringing the grandchildren. I'm going to teach them how to fish at the pond, the way I taught Michael when he was their age." A robin landed on Helen's stone, cocking its head at Walter as if listening to his words. Walter laughed softly. "Is that you, checking up on me? You always did a perfect timing." The robin chirped once and flew away, disappearing into the oak tree. Walter stood, brushing the dirt from his knees. He looked at the graves one more time, then turned toward the house. But he stopped after just a few steps. There was a sound, a distant sound getting closer, the sound of an engine on the gravel road that led to his property. Walter walked in front of the house and watched as an old pickup truck pulled up to his gate. A young woman got out, maybe 30 years old, with tired eyes and a hesitant expression. And beside her, jumping down from the cab of the truck, was a dog, a German shepherd puppy, no more than 6 months old, with paws too big for its body and ears that flopped instead of standing straight. The woman approached the gate, the puppy prancing beside her on a leash. "Mr. Morgan," she called out, "I'm sorry to bother you. My name is Jenny. I work at the shelter in town. I heard about what happened with Max, about his journey to find you. Everyone heard about it." Walter walked slowly toward the gate, his eyes fixed on the puppy who was now straining at the leash, tail wagging furiously. "This guy was brought in last week," Jenny continued. "Abandoned on the highway, just like so many others. He's healthy and sweet, and he deserves a good home. But we're overcrowded and underfunded, and I thought maybe if you heard his story you might consider giving him a chance. And I know it's too soon, and I know Max can never be replaced, but sometimes love isn't about replacement, it's about continuing. And I'm sorry I'm rambling, I just had this feeling that I should come here and ask, and please say something because I'm making a fool of myself. Walter looked at the puppy. The puppy looked at Walter, and something passed between them, something wordless and ancient and profound. Walter opened the gate. "What's his name?" he asked. Jenny's face lit up with hope. "He doesn't have one yet. We were waiting for his forever family to choose." Walter knelt down, and the puppy immediately bounded forward, licking his face with enthusiastic abandon. Walter laughed, a real laugh, full and warm and alive. He looked up at the sky, then back at the garden where Helen and Max rested beneath their stones. "His name is Hope," Walter said. "His name is Hope." And as he carried the puppy up the driveway toward the house that had been empty for too long, Walter could have sworn he heard two sounds carried on the spring breeze: the bark of an old German shepherd, joyful and approving, and the laughter of a woman with green eyes and a smile that could end any argument.